All right, folks, it is 7 p.m., so we're going to get started here. Thank you all for joining us on this lovely spring day. If you're here in Marblehead, what a great April it has started to turn out to be. But we're excited to have you all with us here tonight. We're also excited, of course, to welcome our speaker for this evening, G. Patrick O'Brien. Uh, Patrick is an assistant teaching professor at the University of Tampa. He holds a PhD in history from the University of South Carolina. And among his many honors and awards, he's received the Carr Fellowship from the Society of the Cincinnati, as well as the Dowse Research Fellowship from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Patrick's research focus is Revolutionary Era women and the Loyalist exile experience in Nova Scotia, which he's going to touch on tonight. His current book project, Unknown and Unlamented, explores the experiences of three generations of one Loyalist family. And in 2023, the New England Quarterly published his article, Duty and Love, which was on the story of an enslaved woman named Flora Lee from Marblehead, which, of course, he's going to be talking to us about tonight. We're going to turn it over to Patrick here in just a moment. And of course, there will be a Q&A session after Patrick concludes speaking tonight. As we continue to admit people here into the Zoom room, I apologize if you hear a little bit of beeping here in the first few minutes of the lecture, but we'll get all that squared away. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to Patrick.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jarrett. And thank you, everybody at the Marblehead Museum. It really is quite a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. The weather's a little bit nicer here in Tampa than I've seen it to be in Marblehead or greater New England, but don't worry, we pay for that in August with sweltering heat and unrelenting rain. So we get our dues. I've got a lot to cover tonight, but I'd like to thank all of you for being here as well. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing with your Thursday evenings, so I really appreciate your enthusiasm for my research and my topic, and I'm hoping to leave some time for question and answer at the end of everything I'd like to cover. So please feel free to ask the questions that you have that I may not get to, and I'll allude to some things that I'm kind of moving through rather quickly. So without further ado then, I've titled my talk today, She Has Become a Great Madam in Town, Flora Lee, Slavery and Resistance in Revolutionary Marblehead. I've also got my email address up there. If anyone doesn't get a chance to ask questions or has further commentary after, please feel free to reach out in email form, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So our driving questions for today, I'm interested in talking a bit about Flora Lee, an enslaved woman, and her path to slavery in Marblehead, because I think it demonstrates the really unique situation that slavery in the late 18th century existed in throughout greater New England. Of course, there are particularities to an urban port like Marblehead or Newport had more in common than, say, the more rural regions of Western Massachusetts or what's now Maine. But I think Flora Lee's story really does demonstrate what made slavery in New England different, although not any less dehumanizing. Secondly, we want to talk about the American Revolution, because one of the points I'm going to make about Flora Lee's enslavement was that she was able to exert some influence over the system in order to achieve some objectives of her own, like keeping her family unit closely intact. But the American Revolution is going to throw that modicum of stability that Lee is able to create for herself into flux. So we're going to look at the American Revolution, how it changed slavery. We're also going to talk about Flora Lee's rather remarkable journey to Nova Scotia and back in the 1780s. And I think that this is probably what differentiates Flora Lee's story from most other enslaved people and tells us something really interesting about slavery across the greater Northeast. We tend to divide slavery in the United States and Atlantic Canada as two different systems. But I think what we see in Flora Lee's story is the commonalities that exist between the two places. And then we'll wrap it up by talking a bit about what we can learn from all of this. How does it complicate the history of slavery and abolition in the late 18th century? And perhaps more importantly, what should we take from this as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, scheduled for 2 years from now? So this is the part that I'll read. This letter that you see excerpted on the screen is going to become important. I'm going to introduce it to you. I think the best way to get everyone excited about the talk today is by reading an excerpt from the same source that brought me to this study. It was the summer of 2017. I was a graduate student at the University of South Carolina, and I received my first grant to study at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. At the time, I believed that I was going to be writing a dissertation about environmental history in the Revolution. I was particularly interested in why the Loyalists hated Nova Scotia so much. If you've ever read Loyalist writings or literature, they tend to describe Nova Scotia as this barren, rocky wasteland. But if anyone's ever been to coastal Maine, I see not much of a difference. But I wanted to get my hands on everything the Loyalists had written from the MHS, so I was pulling anything that was labeled Loyalists. Having spent a lot of time in Halifax as a kid, one of the collections stood out to me was the Roby Sewell family papers. Roby Street is a major thoroughfare in Halifax, and while I should have assumed that there was some Loyalist connection, I didn't know anything about the family. And more importantly, I didn't know if the writings in this archive were going to be anything I was interested in. What I came to find were 3 archival boxes full of letters tracing the family's experience during and after the war, one really unique diary of a young woman's time as a Loyalist refugee in Halifax, and other personal writings from a Loyalist family that was forced to flee Marblehead, resettle in Nova Scotia in the early days of the war, only to return, well, most of them, and seamlessly reintegrate into American society. I didn't know it then, but this box and these boxes of letters changed my research project and now my current book project. Over the next few weeks, I began painstakingly piecing together this family's story, and especially the who's who of these letters and writings. And while it was a slow but methodical process, one letter from July 1799, which you see on the screen right now, proved especially challenging, but also promised to open up a whole new aspect of my research. Addressed to Mary Bradstreet Roby in Halifax, and signed only by, as you see here, your loving and affectionate grandmother, H.L., the letter addressed an issue that appeared only briefly in the rest of the writings: slavery. Rest of the writings, slavery. In the letter writer describes how the revolution turned social relations, especially those between free and enslaved people, upside down. And I'll quote here: "As to Flora," the letter writer relayed, "she has become a great madam in town. She relishes and frolic as well as any of the other Negroes who do nothing else but visit about from one house to another," end quote. The reason for this excitement, the writer explained, was the prosperity brought about by wartime privateering. Quote again: "Their husbands go a privateering, and hers among the rest, and bring home their black ladies such things as enabling them to look down with contempt upon many of the whites. But this is under the rose, for we dare not say anything," end quote. In explaining that she kept her thoughts under the rose, meaning in private or secret, the letter writer conveyed how deeply surprised her fellow slave owners in Marblehead were by the reversal of fortunes brought about by the Revolution. But if this section of the letter demonstrated the mutability brought about by the Revolution, a brief note in the postscript, and that's what you have on the screen, suggests that little had changed. The writer thanked Mary Bradstreet Roby for sending shoes and citron, asked her to express the writer's hellos to fellow family members in Halifax, but concluding, the writer referenced Flora again. Quote, "Flora sends her duty to you and her love to her child." This concluding line raised many questions. Who was this child? And what was the child's relationship to the Robys? Why was the child in Halifax and not in Marblehead with her mother? Did Flora ever see this child again? If so, how and when? In my talk tonight, I want to share with you all some of the answers I've uncovered to those questions, and use Flora's remarkable fight against her and her extended family's enslavement to shine light on broader questions of the Revolutionary era, and exemplify how crucial it is that we highlight and tell these stories if we really want to understand the successes and failures of the Revolutionary era. A quick word about telling the stories of people who are marginalized in the archive. Telling the stories of enslaved accurately is not without significant challenges. Flora did not leave archival records of her own. In fact, on this image you see here, it's probably the only place in the archive that Flora Lee's voice comes through clearly. The evidence that does remain is drawn from the writings of her enslavers, several generations of a single New England family. Like the other slave owners across New England, the extended Roby family had a vested interest in asserting their authority and over the people they held in bondage, from whom they expected obedience and deference, which they glossed as faithfulness. Their personal writings defended this power. They promoted a self-interested ideology that they had a paternalistic and generational relationship to the people that they held in bondage. They meant this record to justify for themselves, their posterity, and perhaps even for the broader community, that their ownership over human chattel was just. For the historian 2.5 centuries later, however, these writings provide a crucial record on otherwise undocumented people. These records enable scholars to, in the words of Paul Lovejoy, put flesh on the bones of the past and enrich the history of the enslaved people, the slave trade, and its opposition in New England. Crucially, telling Flora's story provides a focused understanding of the strategies enslaved New England women used to resist the dehumanizing aspects of slavery, despite an archival record that is, as Marissa Fuentes explains, partial, incomplete, and structured by privileges of class, race, and gender. Wading through the personal correspondence, diary entries, probate records, and other materials generated by the Roby family reveals the currents that defined Flora's life through the Revolutionary period. But importantly, and contrary to the enslavers' designs and interests, these documents also inadvertently disclose Flora's resistance to domination and control, while also demonstrating her ability to effect change for herself and for the members of her family. So I think this letter is a really important entry point into my talk. It is how I came to become interested in Flora's story. Despite the brevity of this line, there was so much to unpack and uncover, and I'm hoping to tell her story and do it justice tonight. So one thing that we may have to do is take a look at the broader extended family trees of both Flora Lee and her enslavers, the Robys. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of this. Piecing this together has been a long and painstaking process. I've tried to highlight the figures that you're going to hear most about today. The letter writer that we were mentioning last slide, that was Hannah Lee. You see her highlighted here. She was the grandmother of Mary Bradstreet Roby, who marries the merchant Thomas Roby in 1759. So we'll be talking about Hannah Lee, Mary Bradstreet Roby, and her daughter, who's also named Mary Roby. So to differentiate the two of them, I'll always use Mary Bradstreet Roby's unmarried name along with her married name to differentiate matriarch from daughter. But Mary Roby becomes Mary Sewell when she returns to Marblehead after Loyalist exile. And then on Flora Lee's side of the family, we'll obviously be talking about Flora Lee. We'll also be talking about two of her children, although I can talk about more in question and answer, a daughter who is unfortunately never named. And this is kind of one of the real sad aspects of studying this, is despite the family's reference to Flora's daughter and this movement from her, from Halifax, or from Marblehead to Halifax, they never use her name. And it's not recorded in birth records that I can find or are available. So I have to refer to her as Flora's daughter, which kind of speaks to the violence of the archive. And another son named Prince. And as we're going to see, Prince has equally as many problems with studying him because it is unclear, although I am very much in the camp, that Prince is not Flora's biological son, but rather an adoptive son, along with Juba, Clarissa, Caesar, and Charles, that she adopts in Halifax. And I can talk a bit about them. But just so we have kind of an idea of some of the people I'll be talking about today, I wanted to show you these trees. So let's talk about Flora Lee and slavery in colonial Massachusetts. What do we know about her? Well, we know from birth records that she's born in July of 1736 to an enslaved couple named Stephen and Dill, who are owned by the prosperous housewright and budding investor Samuel Lee Jr., who lives in Manchester, right next door, Manchester, Massachusetts. Lee is a housewright. He is someone who builds homes in the growing town of Manchester and, as you all probably know, a considerable number of homes in colonial Marblehead as well, especially as the size of Marblehead's population grows in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. A number of the homes, some of the nicest homes in town, are going to be built by Samuel Lee Jr., who will eventually remove to Marblehead as well. We don't know much about Stephen and Dill. We know that Stephen worked in the warehouses that Samuel Lee Jr. and his son Jeremiah Lee, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, owned and operated. We know that Dill did housework in the home, We know that Flora had a couple of other siblings, but we don't know too much more than that. We do know that around 1743, late in the year, Samuel Lee Jr.'s wife, Mary Tarring Lee, dies. And this moment is important because, as you can see in the advertisement on the right, it prompts Samuel Lee to advertise for sale not only his very large estate in Manchester to remove to Marblehead more permanently and go into the trade with his son, but also, as you can see, and I've highlighted, to attempt to find a buyer for what he calls, quote, likely Negro girl about 6 years old. This is Flora Lee. We don't know much about what happened to her siblings. We do know that one of her siblings will be sent to live with one of Lee's other children, not Jeremiah Lee, but one of his other children in nearby Beverly. So we can assume that perhaps Stephen and Dill were divvied up in similar ways along with the other children. It's not entirely clear, but we know that at least in 1744, Samuel Lee owns Flora Lee and is actually attempting to sell her. The sale is directly related to the death of his wife. A young enslaved girl is incredibly valuable to a matriarch. This is someone who can help with household chores, who can do laundry work, who can help with chores around the home. But to Samuel Lee, the housewright, she is entirely, I don't want to say worthless because that's horrible to say, but she is not of value to him. He would have seen her as both a financial burden and beyond the realm of his knowledge. This is someone who operates in the public as opposed to the private sphere. So upon the death of his wife, he advertised for the girl's sale. He never finds a buyer for Flora Lee because instead, the next year in 1745, in Marblehead, Samuel Lee marries the widow Hannah Sweat, only a month after his son Jeremiah Lee married Martha Sweat. Hannah Sweat was Martha Sweat stepmother. And so Samuel Lee Jr. and his son Jeremiah both marry Sweat women. Samuel Lee is going to marry Hannah Sweat, and this gives him reason to no longer sell Flora Lee. Now Flora Lee has value to his home again, in possession of his wife, who can help with the household chores and the other domestic work that young enslaved girls tended to do. We also know how important Flora was to the now Hannah Lee, because when Lee dies, Samuel Lee dies in 1753, his will bequeaths Flora to Hannah Lee. And what's interesting about this will is that we know that Samuel Lee Jr. either owned directly or was in partial ownership of other enslaved people. But the only person mentioned in the will and bequeathed is the girl Flora Lee, who would have been 16 years old at this time, and left to his widow Hannah, demonstrating to us once again the value and the importance of young enslaved women, especially to widows. Interestingly enough, Sweat had also bequeathed his enslaved property, a woman named Violet, to Hannah Sweat before her marriage. So in both instances where Hannah Lee is widowed, the deceased husband leaves enslaved property to the possession of his widow, kind of demonstrating to us how important these young women were to grown women, slave owners. We don't know much about Flora Lee in the years in between 1753 and the beginning of the Revolutionary Era. We don't have many letters from Hannah Lee. The Roby family's writings, as we'll see in a moment, are a little bit quiet on the details. But we do know that around the year 1772, the same year that Thomas Roby, and I'll introduce him in a moment, moves his family into the large brick home that still stands on modern Washington Street. At the same time that the Roby family moves into this home, Hannah Lee gives a child, Flora's daughter, whose name again is never used in the records, to her granddaughter, Mary Bradstreet Roby, and her growing family. At this point, if you think back to our family tree a few slides ago, Mary Bradstreet Roby has 3 children. She'll have 4 before she leaves Marblehead. She needed help in hands. The records show us that the Robys were owners of 1 enslaved person at the time of the Revolution. This was Flora's daughter, who had been gifted to her granddaughter, Hannah Lee's granddaughter, Mary Bradstreet Roby, around the year 1772. In 1775, only weeks after the Revolution begins, the Roby family flees Marblehead, and they go to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I'll have some more about that in a future slide, but they take the young girl away with them. This is the girl that's referenced in the letter from 1779 that I opened with. We also know that the Reverend Isaac Story is going to marry Flora Lee and Pompey Hooper in 1778. We don't know much about who Pompey Hooper is, but that last name is suggestive, probably a relation to, of course, the prosperous Hooper family of Marblehead. We don't know much about him other than he did privateer work per Hannah Lee's letter from 1779. We know that they have at least 3 children, a son named Pomp, another son named Peak, and the daughter who is unfortunately never named. Pomp and Peak go to live with their father probably in Beverly during the time of the Revolution and kind of fade out of the historical record. We know that in 1781, Hannah Lee dies. And Hannah Lee's will is also incredibly interesting because the first person mentioned in it, despite the fact that most of Hannah Lee's belongings she leaves to her 3 granddaughters, the first person mentioned in the will is her enslaved woman, Flora. And she says this, "In consideration of her faithful service to me, the bed and bedstead whereon she lieth, with the clothes thereof, my rough gown, the half-dozen cane chairs with the oval maple table, and the small looking glass appertaining to the kitchen apartment." We don't know what Flora Lee's status became upon the death of Hannah Lee in 1781, but because Massachusetts had at least theoretically, and we can talk about this later, theoretically abolished slavery, it's likely that Hannah Lee intended Flora Lee to be emancipated. Although that is never mentioned in the will, it is not directly stated. There's no archival record of an emancipation document for Flora Lee, but we do know that she leaves Marblehead shortly after this death, either in 1781 or early 1782. Flora Lee boards a boat, probably from Boston, a packet that was going to Halifax in the midst of the American Revolution. So you can imagine kind of how arduous this journey would have been, how dangerous this journey would have been. Privateering, looting is incredibly prominent in the Bay of Fundy in the Gulf of Maine during this period. But Flora Lee is going to make the 4-day sail to Halifax. So that also brings us back to the Roby family because these stories are intertwined. Thomas Roby came to Marblehead in 1757, probably from Boston, where he served as an apprenticeship in the importing business. And he began selling hardware in the town of Marblehead, which was incredibly lucrative given how fast Marblehead was growing. And even more lucrative, he marries the daughter of the Reverend Simon Bradstreet in 1759, which elevates him into some of the town's most elite circles because the Reverend Simon Bradstreet had a fine home in Marblehead, was also a slave owner, and ran in some of the most prominent circles, not just in Marblehead, but in coastal Massachusetts. Thomas Roby begins to run afoul of the Patriot majority of the region in 1769, when he's accused of breaking the non-importation agreements. And he's accused publicly in the newspapers. He attempts to defend himself, but it doesn't really amount to much. The following year, Roby's cousin, who was also the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and as we'll see later, a pretty staunch loyalist, Jonathan Sewell, names Thomas Roby a Justice of the Peace, which once again runs him afoul of the Patriot majority of Marblehead. Roby wanted to become a Justice of the Peace because it got him out of militia duty. He didn't want to train with the militia. He didn't want to be involved in the Massachusetts militia. And so he begged his cousin to name him a Justice of the Peace, which doesn't gain him many friends in the town of Marblehead, where militia training is public, celebrated, and something that's very much important to the Patriot majority of the town. It's in 1772, like I said, that Roby moves the family into the home that still stands on Washington Street. In 1774, when the colonial crisis was heating up, Thomas Roby makes a couple of important moves. First of all, he signs his name to a letter endorsing Thomas Hutchinson, who has been recalled to London. That gets publicly published in the newspapers of New England. So the 23 names that are on this letter are going to be villainized, not just in Marblehead, but across greater New England as supporters of the crown and supporters of the really despised former colonial governor, Thomas Hutchinson. In that same year, because business was so bad for Roby, he mortgages his home for £800. This might also tell us he had a bit of a sense of what was coming, that he was going to be driven from the town in the months or days, perhaps, that followed. He also draws up a will at this exact same time that's hastily written, leaves everything in possession of Hannah Lee, his wife's grandmother, and makes a couple of choice notes about what's going on during the colonial crisis. And then on May 2nd, 1775, the Roby family is finally driven from Marblehead, only days, weeks after the beginning of the American Revolution. They flee with Thomas Roby's widowed sister, Hetty Higginson, along with her daughter and the enslaved girl. And interestingly, we can talk about this in just a second, they choose not to go to neighboring Boston, which is where most of the loyalists at the time were held up. Instead, they sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I've got an image here that I think is an important one when we think about the loyalist diaspora of the Revolutionary era. When I use the term loyalist, at least in the United States, my students anyway, you're probably all a little bit more informed than they are, but my students always tend to figure the losers of the revolution. I'll ask, who were the loyalists? And I had someone in my upper level class say, oh, they're just the losers of the revolution. And I think that type of understanding is a bit simplified, right? If I ask the same question in Canada, people tend to tell me they're the winners of the American Revolution, which is an even more interesting take. But this image right here sums up a lot of what we should know about the Loyalists. This is a detail of a portrait of John Eardley Wilmot. So this is a portrait within a portrait, but it's called The Reception of the American Loyalists in the year 1783. And it's painted in 1812 by the very famous American-born painter who's also a favorite of George III, Benjamin West. And you'll see here that even in the early 19th century, the Americans, the British, understood something that a lot of people do not understand today. The Loyalist diaspora is incredibly diverse. On the right side of this image, you'll see the upper echelons of colonial society. These are the Anglican ministers, these are the judges, the magistrates, the governors. But the entire left side of the portrait is dedicated to minority figures. In the middle is an indigenous man. To the left, you see enslaved populations reaching out to Britannia. There is a veiled woman in mourning, clearly. So in the early 19th century, most people understood something that a lot of people don't totally grasp today, and that's this diversity of the Loyalist population. When we use that term Loyalist, we're almost doing them an injustice, because it suggests that they shared an ideological commitment to the British Empire, king and parliament, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that there's very little homogeneity between the Loyalist population. They come from the social, economic, and religious milieu that was the colonies in the late 18th century. You have all kinds of people associated with them. About 20% of the white population could have been considered Loyalists at any time in the war. And historians estimate that about 500,000 people probably fell under the Loyalist umbrella at some point in the war. Of course, of those 500,000 people, only about 60 to 100,000 are going to flee the American colonies in 1783. So the vast number of Loyalists actually remain in the United States, which is also something that's kind of unknown about the Loyalists, at least in broader populations. It's also very much understudied in broad populations, the place of Black Loyalists. We know that roughly a third of all runaway slaves during the Revolution were women who took with them families, which is a higher percentage than before the war. We know that around 1,500 to 2,000 Black Loyalists are going to land on the shores of what are now the Canadian Atlantic provinces, so mostly Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but you will find some in St. John's Island, which is modern-day Prince Edward Island. And so again, thinking about this Loyalist diaspora as a diverse community is incredibly important. It also gets us to talk about the Roby family a little bit more and their interesting decision to sail not for Boston, but for Halifax. Talk a little bit about why that is. Jonathan Sewell, the Attorney General for Massachusetts, and Thomas Roby's cousin, is also a Vice Admiralty Court judge whose position is seated in Halifax. So Sewell advises Roby that his best bet would be go to Halifax as sort of an advanced guard, an early loyalist for the people who would eventually come and follow to Halifax to ride out the war. Now, keep in mind, in May of 1775, most loyalists held up in Boston imagine that this rebellion is going to be put down in weeks, perhaps months, but it's not going to be long running. So Sewell advises Roby not to settle in Boston, but to go to Halifax as sort of an advanced guard. And his plan was to join him later. Jonathan Sewell wrote many letters to Roby from being held up in Boston, and all of them are incredibly dire. For example, in July of 1775, about a year before the Declaration of Independence, this one really stood out to me. For a month past, you meet as many dead folks as live ones. So the Loyalists held up in Boston were suffering under some pretty extreme circumstances. Many of them had plans to go to Halifax for short periods of time, and it's likely that the Roby family is going to Halifax as sort of an advance guard for these later Loyalists. Ultimately, however, many of the Loyalists in Boston decide that Halifax is not going to be a long-term destination, and I'll show you why in just a moment. Even Sewell never travels to Nova Scotia, at least not originally. He'll go to London instead and petition for a position in government, a better position in government in what is now Atlantic Canada as the war dragged on. He eventually settles in St. John, New Brunswick, where he dies in 1797. So why did the Loyalists despise Nova Scotia so much? It's interesting because Halifax lies only 415 nautical miles northeast of Boston, and in the 18th century, we're talking about a 4-day sail. Despite its proximity, many New Englanders had really negative views of the region as this kind of nascent fringe of empire where there's still a French influence, there's still an indigenous power. It's the opposite of what New England was. A lot of this despise and this hatred for Nova Scotia comes from a group of loyalists, I'm sorry, a group of New Englanders who tried to settle in Nova Scotia in the 1750s and 60s during Le Grand Déneigement, the removal of the Acadians. These were called the New England Planters. And their attempt to settle Nova Scotia goes really, really poorly. And many of them come back to New England with very negative things to say about the British Empire, about trying to establish farmland in Nova Scotia, about the rocky soil, about the unpreparedness of the region to host settlers. And I think it's interesting to remember this when we talk about the Loyalist arrival. The image you see there comes from 1781, a depiction of Halifax. This is a far more frontier society than Marblehead would have been in the late 18th century, which was one of the largest colonial towns in North America and one of the wealthiest. So to remove from one of those towns, where there are all the advantages of a real British colonial town, to this nascent fort of Halifax was incredibly jarring for many of our loyalists. Mary Bradstreet Roby has this great line. So in January of 1776, Mary Bradstreet Roby is writing to Thomas Roby, who had sailed to London to be with Sewell. And she says this: "So much for Halifax. I wish I had never seen it. Now, if I knew what to say more, I would write on by way of amusement for myself, for I have no other. And if I thought that it would be any, and had my New England head, I believe I should. But if that is not the case, and this dumb and stupid place furnishes no topic for either conversation or writing, I shall conclude." So this is, in no uncertain terms, a real kind of negative depiction of what life in Loyalist Halifax was in 1776, only months after the Roby family arrived. But I want to draw your attention to that line, "if I had my New England head." I think that this is like a really important gesture on Mary Bradstreet Roby's part. I think she's saying that this town is underdeveloped. It doesn't have the luxuries that she was accustomed to as an upper-class woman in Marblehead. That's the dumb and stupid part. But I think that line about the "my New England head" tells us something really important. The refugees from the American Revolution saw their removal to Atlantic Canada as altering to their intrinsic disposition. They believe that being removed from their ancestral home, I mean, the Bradstreet family is one of the oldest families in New England, has a really long history related to a colonial governor, and to be removed to Nova Scotia by force would have been altering for how they viewed themselves. And the Patriots were all too happy to publish letters like these, although not this one, but others, that described in really no uncertain terms how horrible living in Nova Scotia was. The Patriots will run a lot of articles in the newspaper describing the Loyalists suffering in what they called, quote, Nova scarcity, which was actually a term that derived during the New England planter settlement of the 1760s, but is revived again during the American Revolution. And this is also very important for how we view the Loyalists. Because if you're to read the literature, there's a big debate about, the Loyalist influence in Atlantic Canada and the British Empire writ large. Canadians tend to view the Loyalists as the founders of British Canada. In the Loyalist mythology, it's the coming of the Loyalists that make Canada British. And the reason they take this position is because they believe that they bring with them kind of all the good things that the American Revolution got rid of in the United States. But if we look more closely at what the Loyalists are writing, once again, we recognize that that term loyalist is incredibly misleading. The Loyalists do not have a single ideological position. Many of them are actually at the time perceived to be Republicans in disguise. And the older settlers of Nova Scotia write in no uncertain terms that they're worried the influx of Loyalists is going to bring the revolution to Nova Scotia. So obviously this kind of Loyalist mythos is misplaced. I think probably the most important thing to realize about the Loyalists is that they didn't use that term to describe themselves, unless of course they were petitioning for money. than they did. But in all of their other writings, they're going to refer to themselves in the term that I think is most apt, and that is refugees. This is arguably one of the first modern refugee crises, and definitely one of the first in the British Empire. And like other refugee crises in the 19th and 20th centuries, 21st centuries, the refugees are suffering under tremendous economic, societal, and emotional distress. When we read the writings of the Loyalists, the thing that stands out the most is suffering. And this is why in some of my other writings, I write that if we're going to really talk about Loyalist communities, we have to study the emotional backbone of suffering that provided the Loyalists the only commonality they had. They didn't have economic, religious, ideological, political, there's no commonality there. But there is commonality in being refugees, and there is commonality in suffering. And so especially for young women, this is important because common bonds of suffering give young women a way to take a very public role in building new community. Young women in the late 18th, early 19th century are expected to express what they called fellow feeling. In the 19th century, they'll reterm this empathy. But refined young women were supposed to demonstrate empathy towards suffering others. It was a sign of their status, of their education, of their understanding. And in a community where suffering abounded, this gave young Loyalist women an important public role as the new community organizers, using suffering to build new community. Mary Roby will term this, quote, gilded misery, which I think is like a really powerful image. And I'll give you an example because we're going to get back to Flora Lee in a second. So I want to juxtapose what happens to Flora with Mary Roby for a moment. In October of 1783, October 4th, 1783, Mary Roby attends the funeral of a girl we know only as Miss Wood. We don't know where she came from. We do know that she was a Loyalist, that she was a recent arrival to Halifax. And Mary Roby is attending this girl's funeral only because they are fellow Loyalists. She had never met Miss Wood. She had no connection to Miss Wood's family. She was obligated to go from a sense of empathy, from fellow feeling, for this woman who had passed. And Roby writes in her diary about attending this funeral, so I'll turn it over to her own words. We imagined that as it was a person we had no regard for, nor had ever seen, that we would be unaffected. But there is something so awful in death that we could not look at it unmoved. This was a young woman of 6 and 20 who was cropped, as it were, in the flower of her age, in a strange place, unknown and unlamented, except by her brother and sister, who could not be but greatly affected. So you see something like really powerful here again. Mary Roby is attending this young woman's funeral out of this kind of sense of compassion and the need to demonstrate that empathy more publicly. But in going there, she begins to see a vision of perhaps where her life is going. And that very much unnerves her, right? So this community of suffering brings Loyalists together, but it also isn't a very good emotion to tie people to their new adoptive home. And as I mentioned, the Loyalist diaspora is made up of thousands of Black formerly enslaved, some people still enslaved, some people in the nebulous in-between, refugees. And again, if suffering is what defines the Loyalists, then probably the Black Loyalists are the best example of what suffering during the Revolution looked like. But to white women like Mary Roby, to highlight the suffering of Black women as comparable to their own, or Black refugees writ large as comparable to their own, would do a little bit to erode the community of suffering. In the 18th century, where racial difference mattered, to imagine that suffering between white and Black people was the same was problematic for the Loyalists like Mary Roby. And even worse for Black Loyalists, there is slavery in Nova Scotia prior to the arrival of the Loyalists. Many of these Black Loyalists are coming as free people. They'd escaped their enslavers to join the British sides. They were fleeing other forms of oppression, and they were technically granted their freedom. Some even had written emancipation papers that they brought with them. And if you're interested in this, you can go to the Nova Scotia archives and you can read the very famous Book of Negroes, as it was called, that documents the Black Loyalists who were going to flee with Guy Carleton in 1783 from New York City and land in Nova Scotia. But the re-enslavement of Black Loyalists is so prominent that in 1789, the Nova Scotia legislature debates, but never passes, a law that would forbid the enslavement of Black people and their sale into the Caribbean. So this kind of re-enslavement and the really precarious position that Black Loyalists were in is important to recognize. It's also important to recognize that Nova Scotia never passes a law for abolition. Slavery would be abolished in Nova Scotia at the same time it is throughout the British Empire. And many of the loyalists, recognizing that this could perhaps happen, tend to call their enslaved people servants. And Harvey Amani Whitfield, a kind of leading historian of this, rightly notes, I think, that this term servant is used to highlight kind of the ambiguous position that Black loyalists were in. Loyalists were using it in order that if there was an abolition law passed, then these people remained enslaved because they weren't slaves to begin with. They were simply servants living and working in the home. It's important to lay that out to talk about Flora Lee. So we know that Flora Lee comes to Halifax. In doing so, she's effectively renouncing her emancipation in Massachusetts to return to servitude in Halifax. Because of the precarious situation that Black loyalists were in, people like Flora ran the risk of re-enslavement in other families or possible sale even to the Caribbean. So she had to maintain a very close association to the Roby family home to prevent kind of more objectionable fates from befalling her. And sadly, Flora Lee's daughter, the very person that she had traveled to see and left Massachusetts to see, dies of a measles epidemic in June of 1783. So only about a year and a half at the longest after Flora Lee had arrived from Massachusetts. And I think it's important to focus on this moment to drive my point about suffering home for a moment. Mary Roby also writes a diary entry about this funeral. It was a girl who lived and worked in their home in both Massachusetts and Nova Scotia. They had speared her away with them in 1775. So she attends the funeral of this young girl. She makes no mention of Flora or how Flora coped with the loss of her daughter. She writes only this, and keep in mind, remember that really affectionate lines about attending the other funeral? Well, listen to this one. Came home, heard the little Negro was dead, felt glad that a period was put to its misery. Is it not natural to suppose I wished her sufferings to end, and that there was no other way by her dissolution I earnestly desired, I may almost say prayed for it. When it arrived, I felt a burden removed from my mind. So again, to kind of drive home that suffering and the difference of suffering, I mean, Mary Roby clearly sees a difference between this enslaved girl who lives and works in her home and the unknown stranger, Miss Wood. The description of these funerals are so entirely different. A year later, Flora Lee also does something rather interesting. As Mary Roby writes, it was a fine day, received an addition to our family, a little black, presented us by Mrs. Flora. That's May 9 of 1784, almost a year after her own daughter had died. It's ambiguous who this boy was. We know his name was Prince. We do not know his relationship to Flora. But what we do know is that the Robys interacted with a number of free people of color who had come to live in Nova Scotia. And if they had, it's likely Flora Lee did as well. What my guess is that Flora Lee is going to play a pivotal role in giving young children, especially those without family members in Nova Scotia, giving these young children an opportunity kind of escape worse fates, re-enslavement in other homes, sale to the Caribbean, a life of poverty and destitution in Nova Scotia because the Black loyalists aren't given good land or economic opportunity, by bringing them to work in the Roby family home. So we see something, again, really distressing here. Flora's best option to protect these children is to subject them to a life of servitude. But for someone like Flora Lee, I think she recognizes the power that she has in the Roby family's home, the power to protect children like her own daughter who had been taken away by bringing them into this home and under her motherly care. The Robys will never write about Flora's adoptive children as her biological children. They'll never use the name Flora's child. They'll always refer to them as their names and their relation to Flora as ma'am. So it's pretty clear that Flora is not their biological mother. They're also baptized when they get back to Salem, and they're baptized with the last name Ball. So they're probably all from the same family, perhaps someone that Flora knew and could give this kind of opportunity to live and work in the Roby family's home. And this also opens a door into another interesting aspect of the Roby family's loyalist experience. They come back to Massachusetts. As you saw in that letter from 1776, especially Mary Bradstreet Roby never warmed to her adoptive home of Halifax. And after she gives birth to her final child named Hannah in March of 1784, she begins petitioning her husband to allow her at least a return home to test the waters. Roby's business has slowed since the end of the American Revolution. the overwhelming numbers of loyalists who had arrived in 1783 and 1784 had brought disease. There was another measles outbreak in Halifax that, of course, frightened the Roby family. And so Mary Bradstreet Roby is able to convince Thomas Roby to let her, the child Hannah, the boy Prince, and her eldest daughter, Mary, to return to Marblehead in the summer of 1784 to test the waters for an eventual repatriation. Now, Thomas is quite clear. You need to come back. This is not a permanent resettlement in the United States. But the Roby women do return. And as you can see from their writings, they write very positively about their return to Marblehead. My favorite is Mary Bradstreet Roby to Thomas Roby from August of 1784. The town is upon the rise. All the men say on the wharf, oh, if we had but Mr. Roby's shop to go to. You can see what's going on here. An attempt to convince her husband that economic opportunity lies not in Nova Scotia. The family's future is not in Halifax, but back in Marblehead. And although they return to Nova Scotia in 1784, they make another trip back to Marblehead in 1787. And this time, Mary Bradstreet Roby is going to play a very important role in securing a more permanent repatriation pathway. And that is the marriage of her eldest daughter, Mary Roby. In the summer of 1788, Joseph Sewell, who was a young merchant in Marblehead, writes to Thomas Roby requesting that he give his permission to marry his daughter, Mary Roby. And the letter he writes is rather interesting because he basically says, I would never have done something so bold if I hadn't been encouraged by your wife, which again shows us the power Mary Bradstreet Roby had and her planning to bring the family back to Massachusetts. This marriage to Sewell does create the connection she wanted. Although she returns to Nova Scotia shortly after their marriage, she comes back the next year in 1789, bringing with her not just their son, but also Flora, and leaving Prince in Massachusetts with the new Sewell family. We know Flora comes back with a couple of children, Juba, Clarissa, Caesar, and Charles. All of them live and work in the Roby family home in Salem and the Sewell family home, which will eventually be in Boston. Even though Massachusetts had formally ended slavery, the Robys refer to these children and Flora as servants. The work that they do includes like beckoning to young children, or responding to the beckons of young children when they ring bells. So we can see that even though they're not technically slaves in post-revolutionary Massachusetts, they're not free either. The economic conditions, the social conditions required that, just like in Halifax, they maintained a close association to the Roby family home and the Sewell family home, who were only too happy to have this available labor wait on them, quite literally, hand and foot. And I can talk a little bit more about that if we have questions and answers, because I could get into the 19th century, but we don't really have the time. I want to stick with the Revolutionary period. To just summarize, I think there's a couple of really important points that we can learn from this story. First of all, that breaking down of the monolithic loyalist image. I think telling stories like Flora Lee's are really important for loyalist studies because it highlights not only the diversity, but also the diversity of objectives, right? Not all of the loyalists were intent on building, quote, the envy of the American states in Nova Scotia. The Robys were not. Flora Lee is certainly not. Both of those families are actually interested in the same thing, preserving the kinship bonds that are vital to their existence. And they have to do so in different ways. But these are both families navigating the tumult of the revolution as best they can, with very little attention to the ideas of republicanism or monarchy. I think also this story of Flora Lee shows us the challenges that faced enslaved people. A lot of historians write about how women in particular used the American Revolution to run away from slavery, to abscond. But Flora Lee didn't have that privilege. Her child had been taken from Massachusetts by the Roby family, and her only connection to this family in Halifax was through her continued enslavement to Hannah Lee. If she lost connection with Hannah Lee, then she also lost connection to the Roby family. And given the tumult of the revolution, even if she sailed to Halifax, it's no guarantee that the Roby family would be there or that she'd be able to find them. So Hannah Lee could not run away. She was required to remain with the extended Roby family. And then finally, as we get to Revolution 250, I know that Marblehead Museum, you guys had Bob Allison, a good friend of mine, talk recently about Rev 250, and I think that this is super important that we think about the semi-sesquicentennial, I hate that word, but the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Undoubtedly, in our schools, there's going to be an attempt by educators of all sorts to talk about the lessons of the revolution. And I think that there's some real opportunity here, but some real dangers as well. I've spoken to a lot of teachers, a lot of educators about the Loyalists, and most of them in the United States and Canada buy into the mythos. That's all they know, that the Loyalists are the losers of the revolution, they're the upper class, or the people who oppose republicanism, or they're the founders of British Canada who brought the great empire to the shores of Canada. I've worked really closely with the Massachusetts Historical Society. So if any of you are educators or you know educators, please point them to the MHS's history source, where teachers can get not only primary source documents that have been scanned from the Massachusetts Archives collections, including that letter from Hannah Lee, but also lesson plans to go along with it, important background, games, fun activities for students of all levels, K through 12, in history source. I think we as educators need to be doing a lot more of this. I think the Revolution at 250 gives us a really important and arguably maybe like last opportunity to make a big push to get primary sources and primary source study into the hands of our students so that they can draw their own conclusions about history. I teach at the university level. My students all come into the required class they have to take. They roll their eyes just like I did. They all come into my required class thinking that history is about memorization. And then what we do is look at primary sources and build our own interpretation. I can't tell you how powerful it is to have students read that same letter that I introduced our talk with today. It is actually moving to watch them work through what's going on in that letter or the description of the funerals. I mean, watching students grapple with that really lets them see kind of a summary of what I've been bringing up to you all today. So I think with that, I can end. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Marblehead Museum, again, for having me. I have a link there to the article that Jarrett mentioned. It is open access. So if you want to read a better summary of what I just talked about, the New England Quarterly has it open access. And of course, I can't help but pitch the book again. Keep your eyes peeled in the summer of 2026 for the semi-sesquicentennial McGill Queen's University Press, Unknown and Unlamented, a Loyalist Family in the Era of the American Revolution. Thank you all so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you, Patrick. And folks, I will make sure to include a link to that article when I send out the recording of this lecture tomorrow so that you all have an opportunity to read it. Now, does anyone have any questions for Patrick? And if you do, please remember to unmute yourself by clicking the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Bill, I think you're muted if you're trying to ask a question there. No? This is your opportunity, folks.
I see David has his hand up. David, I'm more than, yes, hi.
I just need to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Bill, and then we'll get to David here.
Patrick, see, did any slaves get passed down to Jeremiah Lee? And what I'm trying to get to is what documentation would say in the sense of how broad slave ownership was among the elites in Marblehead.
Yes, I meant to look this up prior to our talk, but in that article, I have the exact number per the census that's done in the 1760s of Marblehead, the enslaved population. I know that we're talking about 2% of Marblehead's population enslaved just before the American Revolution. So slave ownership is quite broad. Talking about exactly who was passed down to Jeremiah Lee, in Samuel Lee Jr.'s own records, there's no clear indication that Samuel Lee passes to his son any enslaved people. But again, we do know that Stephen, the enslaved father of Flora Lee, works in the Lee family warehouses in Marblehead, which of course were owned by both Samuel Lee Jr. and his son Jeremiah. So in terms of actual possession, legal possession, it's somewhat difficult to say if there's kind of a connection between Samuel Lee Jr. and his son. But in terms of how it was practiced, we do know that enslaved people worked for both of them, often simultaneously. So I don't know if that answers your question as well as you would have wanted, but we do know from our census records a number, about an approximation, although once again, there's some problems with this census number because a lot of people tended to fabricate how many slaves they owned because they had to pay a tax. They had to pay money for each number was counted. So we know of examples of people who underreport because in their own writings they have one number and in the census they have another. So we can imagine that was probably somewhat higher than that percentage I had given earlier.
When you mention working for, um, is this in the form of enslaved people being rented out to others actually for income purposes?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, within the Lee family, I can tell you this. It was quite common for family members to not necessarily rent out by contract, but to lend enslaved property, especially from fathers to sons. So I don't have the documentation. It kind of wasn't my research about Samuel Lee and Jeremiah, but I do know that Samuel Lee Jr. is going to give a number of his enslaved people to other of his children. So I've traced those. I can't say for certain that he did the same thing to Jeremiah, but there is evidence that other of his children, Jeremiah's siblings, received enslaved property from their father. So there is a possibility that that happened.
Okay, thank you.
David, we'll go to you next.
Hi, thank you for an extremely interesting talk. I'm curious, was she at all, to any degree, literate? Or I'm talking about Flora Lee. And sort of an accompanying question would be, do we have any records of how she herself felt regarding any of the events in her life?
So the closest voice we have to Flora Lee, I cannot say if she's literate. I have no records of her writing. So if we're going to use that as an assumption, then I would say no. But the closest we have to her voice in the archive is that letter where she, extends her duty to you and her love to her child. That's Hannah Lee passing on a message, but it's what Flora Lee would have said or wanted expressed. The only other way we hear Flora Lee's voice is through the Robies. So there are examples of, for example, Hetty Roby, one of the Robies who remains in Halifax. She laments after her family returns to Massachusetts. She laments losing connection to Flora because she was, quote, such a good servant. We also know that in the early 19th century, Flora Lee plays an important role raising one of the Sewell children, Samuel Edmund Sewell, who is a leading abolitionist in New England history. He's one of the original patrons of William Lloyd Garrison. In the biography that's written about him, the reason he's an abolitionist, according to the lore of the family, is because a young black woman an elderly black woman, I should say, named Flora, quote unquote, raised him as a child. So in this 19th century biography, there's a reference to Flora, but she again falls into the background, right? She is this motherly figure who instilled this sense of abolitionism in the child because they mentioned that she had been formerly enslaved. Of course, neglecting that it was that same family who had formerly enslaved her. Of course, that's missing from the abolitionist literature. So the only time we have any reference to Flora, her characteristics, what she thought, what she was trying to achieve, comes through the voice of the Robies, which makes telling her story challenging, but also possible, right? That's kind of like reading against the grain in the sources to piece her story together from the voices of her enslavers to show her agency.
Do we have any idea where she's buried?
Man, I have been trying to find this one out for quite a while. We don't even really know when she dies. My closest finding, and I didn't use it in the article because it's totally speculative, but in a talk like this, I can speculate, so I'm doing it. In the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, there are two obituaries that stand out to me as super important. One of them is for a woman who had lived in the Story home named Phyllis. They write that Phyllis dies at the age of 126, had formerly been a princess in Africa, kind of your traditional tropes of motherly enslaved figures. And shortly thereafter, there is an obituary for a woman named Flora, who dies in the poorhouse, similar age, 120 some, also had formerly been a princess in Africa. And Phyllis and Flora have a lot of connections because the Story home is where the Robies lived when they returned to Marblehead until they bought a home in Salem. So we know that Flora worked alongside Phyllis. And if Phyllis gets this obituary, my guess is that other one for Flora is Flora's obituary. But, if I were going to put that in a journal article, they'd need me to prove it, and I can't do that. So we know that she dies, if that's the case, in the late 18 teens. just before 1820. And she's probably buried in Salem because she was living in the poorhouse there. But I don't know if there's a marker. I've never been told there is one. I've never been able to find one.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions for Patrick?
Yeah, Michelle, I see your hand there. I don't know.
Yeah, hi Patrick. Thanks so much. That was such an interesting, whole interesting presentation. I've been trying to do some research into the 3 enslaved people who were mentioned in Jeremiah Lee's will.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is named Cupid. And there are 3, I think, of his children listed as having been baptized, like on the same day in Newburyport. And one of them is named Flora. But I don't know how old they all are at that time, right? I mean, they could easily be not children, but I don't know. And I didn't sort of look ahead of time to see if those line up at all, but did she go in Newburyport at all?
It is interesting. As far as I can tell, no. I can trace her kind of movement pretty clearly from Manchester to Marblehead, Marblehead to Halifax, Halifax back to Marblehead to Boston and Salem. So I don't have any record of her in Newburyport. The name Flora is a fairly common name for enslaved people, especially enslaved women. So it's often derailed my research entirely. I find a Flora somewhere, I research her for 3 days and realize it's not the same Flora, which is incredibly frustrating. I've been trying to find, if anyone wants to do me a favor, if anyone can find more information about Pompey Hooper, her husband, that is in the marriage record. We do know he involved in privateering because of that letter, fairly successful at it, but I can find really no trace of him. There is a mention in the marriage records of Beverly for a Pomp Hooper, who I believe is Flora Lee's son, the Pomp Hooper, who weds at the turn of the 19th century. But again, he falls out of the record as well. So I think, Michelle, what you bring up is what's really difficult about doing these types of studies, right? Is that these people move in the background of a lot of the writings that survive in the archive. And following them from place to place, or like our question from David, trying to say for certain where people are buried, it becomes very, very difficult to do because they're seen as kind of secondary to the larger narrative for the people who are keeping the records.
Yeah, I did. I mean, just as a quick follow-up, there are Jeremiah Lee's widow married somebody whose name I can't recall at the moment, and they moved to Newburyport and so brought the enslaved people with them, in addition to Cupid Lee, who was basically a free guy, and he sort of used Lee as a last name, but then also used a different last name sometimes, and maybe even came up with his own last name at one point. So yeah, as you say, it's you don't even have the last names and then common first names. So
absolutely.
It's Tracy, by the way. It was Mary Tracy, Lee and Martha and Jeremiah's daughter, who married Tracy, and they bring Cupid there. Cupid is there eventually. There is a question in the chat from Lou. What do you know about 1790 U.S. Census listings of the folks you've described?
That is a great question. I can trace the Sewell family's ownership. This is how part of the reason I know Flora is still around at times when she's not being referenced in the Roby family writings. The Sewell family has listed in 1790, again in 1800, again in 1810, a servant living in their home. This is Flora, because we know that at those times, they'll write about Flora making the trip with them from Boston to Salem, even as she's aging. So we know that Flora remains a servant in the Sewell family's home through 1810. In 1820, she is not there. They do not own a servant, which again gives me reason to believe that obituary I had mentioned before, which is, I forget if it's 1818 or 1819, is Flora, because in the next census, she is absent. The Sewell family no longer records a servant in their home. So the problem with those census data, again, is that we have descriptions of patriarchs, of the heads of household. Oftentimes we can get children and wives, but servants' names are not always recorded. And so while we have these numbers and these enumerations, we don't always have any other information about them. So you have to go into their personal writings, and it makes it difficult.
Eileen, I see a hand there.
Yeah, I just want to ask, my husband comes from Louisiana, and there the the Catholic parishes kept records of at least the first names of all the children born, and then if they were baptized or not. Then it would say, you know, Anna, a Negro child, and the date that they were born and the date they were baptized. And sometimes, and usually it gave a mother's name, and of course, never last names. But do I take it that the various Protestant churches in Marblehead didn't record anything about enslaved people?
No, they actually do. That's part of how we can trace these children who come back from Halifax. So in Salem, this is again in Salem, not in Marblehead, but in the Salem records, there's a baptismal record for these children, for Juba, for Prince, for Clarissa, for Charles, and I believe that's it. But it all says their last name is listed as Ball, their mother is listed as Flora Lee, and it says born in Halifax. But for Prince, for example, it says that Prince was born in Halifax in 1793. Well, we know that that's not the case because Prince is brought into the Roby family home in the 1780s. So again, these records do exist. We do have baptismal records, but the information that gets recorded in them is often convoluted. We don't know when exactly it's put in. We don't know its purpose. Sometimes it's meant to do certain things that are beyond kind of just the spiritual, to record people's locations and itemize them. But we do have them. They exist in the Congregationalist churches. There's very little detail. Like you noted, you know, mother's name, maybe a last name. This one says born in Halifax, which is super fascinating because they're not. But I guess telling the story of like adopted in Halifax was more complicated. So we left it at born in Halifax and brought back to Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Patrick, folks?
Yeah. Could I ask a question also, please? You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, or at least we turned it on, you were speaking about the women who were showing the things they had obtained from their husbands who were working as privateers. But I wasn't clear. Were these free Black men who were working as sailors? Were these slaves who were working for the captains of these ships? What was their role exactly?
It's
privateer.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Unfortunately, I really can't answer it much better because I have the same ones that I'm trying to unravel. There's very little scholarship on enslaved or people of color serving as privateers. So we don't really have examples of this kind of study. If we do read books about pirating and privateering, not necessarily in the Revolution, but more broadly, we do know that a lot of pirate ships and privateering ships that people of color were treated as equals, often free. And we do know that the bounty that's captured is obviously divided amongst them evenly. If these privateers are coming back with wealth that allows their wives to be better off in better circumstances than even their enslavers, it really shows us something about how that wealth was distributed. I think Pompey Hooper is going to use some of the fortune that he uses to himself if he was still enslaved. I think that's why he falls out of the record. Unfortunately, there's a lot more records for people who were enslaved because they generated records more so than free people. So that we have so little on Pompey Hooper suggests that he was free. But it's unclear as his status on this privateering ship, if he's enslaved or if he's free. Unfortunately, we just don't know.
I mean, you mentioned pirates. I mean, I assume there was quite a bit of distance between being on a pirate ship and being on a privateer ship. A privateer ship was theoretically working for the government. It was sort of George Washington's navy under the table, so to speak, as a secret navy they call it.
Sure, which actually would lead us, yeah, that would lead us to suggest that perhaps they are free. I mean, in the early American Navy, the book Blackjacks covers this. There's a significant number of formerly enslaved people serving in the American Navy during the Revolution. And some of them still enslaved. I have a friend who's working on a book about this right now, that both the Army and the Navy for the American Revolution employed enslaved people. So again, the privateers, you're right, these could be people employed by the government as slaves. They could be emancipated. They could be kind of taking advantage of them, the tumult of the revolution to serve on these ships. It's rather ambiguous.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks. Then thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you again to Patrick for the talk. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we want to mention to you, our next lecture, I'll just briefly mention, is Thursday, April 18th. It's going to be with Dina Vargo, a local author who will be talking about her book, Hidden History of Boston. You can find more information about that, as well as tickets on our website. And otherwise, thank you for joining us and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you
Thank
all
you,
so
Patrick.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Jared. Thank you for the invitation. It was truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to do this.
Absolutely. And certainly come by and say hello if you make it to Marblehead later this year.
That is my plan. I hope to see you in the summer.
Okay.
Yeah, let
sounds
us know when
great.
you're coming.
I
Thank
will,
you.
absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for your questions, everyone. Thanks.